Okay, so all those ideals that shaped and sustained the American Revolution had massive effects on its society as well. And not just American society, but places in Europe and the Caribbean as well. And I reckon we ought to talk about it, so if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, now as I mentioned in a previous video, one of the main factors that secured an American victory in the Revolutionary War was the widespread adoption of powerful ideas. And ideas, as we know, have consequences, sometimes altogether unforeseen. For example, our boy Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, and that such a truth was so far beyond argument that it was just self-evident. And to call something self-evident means that the only criterion for believing it is that you have a pulse and at least a minimally operative thinky zone. And so Americans really latched onto this idea that all people were created equal. But then, both during and after the Revolution, people began looking around and growing question marks over their head because certain social structures seem to contradict this truth, and I'm going to give you 2 examples. Oh, and by the way, if you want Noteguides to follow along with this video on all my videos, then check the link in the description. Okay, first, revolutionary ideals increased awareness of the inequalities of the system of slavery. Now, many delegates in the Continental Congress were themselves planters and slave owners, including Thomas Jefferson, and many of them were not ignorant of the contradiction between championing liberty for all men while simultaneously enslaving a portion of them. So why didn't they just go ahead and ban slavery right there? Well, it's complicated, but one particular event made them a little twitchy, namely the issuing of Dunmore's proclamation during the war. So when the Revolutionary War spread to Virginia, the Loyalist governor Lord Dunmore issued a proclamation which said that any indentured servant or enslaved black person who fought on behalf of the British would soon afterward earn their freedom. And as it turned out, many enslaved blacks did take Dunmore up on that offer and fought on the British side. And while Dunmore's proclamation raised the possibility for freedom in the minds of black Americans, it got Southern colonial leaders real sweaty because it stoked their fears of enslaved rebellions. And it further made them sweaty on account of it challenged the rigid social hierarchy on which all of their wealth and status was built. In fact, Jefferson actually included an indictment against slavery in the Declaration of Independence, but the rest of the Congress shut that right down because they feared that such an inclusion might alienate the Southern colonies. Therefore, after the war, when new state constitutions were being written, most of them permitted slavery to remain. Only Vermont's constitution abolished slavery, and Pennsylvania's mandated a gradual emancipation of enslaved people. But as you might imagine, when black people of all stripes heard that all men are created equal, they assumed that such an ideal meant that all men, including black people, were equal, and therefore slavery had no place in the new republic. But since these elite planters relied heavily on slavery in order to maintain their status and wealth, the institution remained entrenched in the United States, serving as a significant contradiction to one of the ideals closest to the heart of American identity. As a result, during the war, thousands of enslaved blacks in the South fled north and joined the growing societies of free blacks that existed, especially in busy port cities. Regardless, this glaring contradiction of revolutionary ideals emboldened some groups to call for the abolition of slavery, most of them residing in the North, where slavery was less important to their economic well-being. And I'd like to tell you that their efforts were fruitful, but, it took like another century before slavery was abolished. Okay, now the second way revolutionary ideals affected society was through calls for greater political democracy. So the revolution itself was both articulated and led by a handful of elite white men. And their desire to be free of the rigid hierarchy of British power did not prepare them for the fact that their ideas would filter down through society and cause common folks to want to rid themselves of the social hierarchy present in the United States. A lot of people are thinking they just exchanged the tyranny of a British hierarchy for an American hierarchy. Well, that's just because they're dumb and poor. Oh yeah, I hear it now, but no, somebody's still got to be on top. And so the flurry of elections that populated government positions became debates on the merits of expanding democracy by recognizing the right to vote for more and more people. As it was, most state constitutions had property requirements for voting, and that led to calls for the removal of such strictures. However, this particular application of revolutionary ideas, just like the abolishment of slavery, would require many years to fulfill. Okay, now let's turn the corner and talk about how revolutionary ideals affected women in the United States. Now, I need to tell you up front that women played a very significant role in securing the victory in the American Revolution. And I know that when you think about the revolution, you most likely think of companies of stanky men hurling their bodies into battle to secure the win. And yeah, that's true, but it is not the whole story. For example, farm wives took up the plow and ran the farms while their husbands fought in the war. Other women became camp followers, which means they traveled with the Continental Army serving as nurses or attended to the needs of the soldiers. Still, other women actually disguised themselves as men and fought right alongside the other stanky men on the battlefield. Anyway, for their vital role in securing independence, women certainly believed that the equality for which the revolution revolution was fought included them as well. And that's not a bad assumption. In fact, even before the revolution began, we can see women already calling out for their rights. For example, Abigail Adams wrote to her husband John Adams while he was at the Second Continental Congress just a couple months before Jefferson finished the Declaration of Independence. And she articulated a clear expectation that women be included in the expansive liberty of the new nation when she said, "Remember the ladies." And if perchance the delegates did not remember the ladies, Abigail wrote, "We are determined to foment a rebellion." Abigail Adams, you diva. However, despite all of this, after the revolution, equality patently did not extend to women, most notably the franchise or the right to vote. However, within women's subordinated social role, men seemed to understand how vital they were to the flourishing of a Republican government. In light of that, Benjamin Rush advanced the idea of the Republican motherhood. And basically, the idea here was that the most important way a woman could contribute to and participate in a Republican society was to thoroughly educate their sons about the notions of liberty and government. And that meant that in general, women were praised for fulfilling their domestic role, but recognizing them as political equals to men? Well, no. I mean, as men saw it, if women's autonomy was recognized, then that would undermine the role of men as head of the household, which would infringe on their liberty. After all, they reasoned someone needed to make the sandwiches, and the right to vote would just distract too much from that womanly duty. Even so, while the notion of the Republican motherhood kept women from active political participation, it did expand their access to education, which was a welcome opportunity for many of them. Even so, political equality for women would have to wait until the 20th century. Okay, now in the previous 2 points, I was emphasizing how revolutionary ideals highlighted social inequalities, but then only had minuscule effects. But here's where I tell you that across the Atlantic world, the American Revolution and the ideals on which it was based had some pretty major effects, mainly in the form of other revolutions based on similar principles. And I'm in the mood to give you 3 examples. First, the American Revolution inspired the French Revolution. If you'll recall, many French soldiers participated in the American Revolution and returned home inflamed with the ideals of democracy. Therefore, when the absolutist turd Louis XVI attempted to tighten his control over France in order to pay his own enormous war debts, the people of France rebelled, overthrew the government, and established a republic. And Enlightenment principles also undergirded the main document of this revolution, namely the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which asserted the principles of natural rights and popular sovereignty. However, the revolutionaries in France went a step further than the Americans and championed social equality as well. And as it turned out, that was more than a little stanky to some Americans who had successfully kept their own social hierarchy intact before and after their revolution. Second, these revolutionary ideals inspired the Haitian Revolution. So Haiti was France's most profitable colony by far, and a small minority of white authorities ruled over a much larger majority of enslaved black laborers whose work in Haiti's various plantations was altogether degrading and brutal. But when news of the French Revolution reached the island, the ideals of freedom and self-rule proved exceedingly attractive to the enslaved population and stirred up a desire to overthrow colonial authorities and dismantle the system of slavery. And so, under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture, the enslaved Haitians revolted and eventually defeated the French, establishing the first black government in the Western Hemisphere. And finally, third, these revolutionary ideals led to various revolutions in Latin America. In that region, Spanish and Portuguese colonies throughout Central and South America were similarly influenced by Enlightenment ideas and began to resent the increasing control their imperial parents were exerting upon them. And so, long story short, military leaders like Simón Bolívar appealed to colonial subjects across racial lines with Enlightenment ideals, including appeals for popular sovereignty and the right to self-rule among the various Spanish colonies. And so, through a series of long and protracted wars, one Latin American colony after another won its independence, and many of them formed republican governments in its wake. Okay, click here to keep watching my other Unit 3 videos, and click here to grab my video note guides, which are going to help you get all the contents of this course firmly crammed into your brain folds. I appreciate you coming around, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.